The ballroom glittered with diamonds and pride, but one man sat in silence, a billionaire CEO isolated at the most glamorous wedding of the year. Whispers circled, mocking his loneliness, until a voice cut through the noise. A young black waitress leaned close and whispered, "Pretend you're with me." What happened next shocked every guest in the room, brought the billionaire to his feet, and left the entire hall holding its breath. Don't just hear about it, experience it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications for more jaw-dropping, unforgettable stories that demand to be told. The chandeliers glowed like frozen waterfalls suspended above the ballroom. Gold reflected in every wine glass, and luxury perfumes mixed with the faint sweetness of roses that lined each table. The wedding of the year had drawn the city's elite, actors, senators, CEOs dressed in tuxedos sharp enough to cut. Every smile looked polished, every laugh rehearsed. And yet, in the middle of all that noise, one man sat alone. Charles Weston, the billionaire CEO known for his steel tower empire, looked small at his table near the far wall. His reputation commanded boardrooms, his name alone shifted investments, but at this glittering wedding he looked like an island no one dared approach. That wasn't because they didn't know him, it was because everyone knew him too well. Charles Weston, ruthless billionaire attending the wedding of clients and allies, but without a companion, without family, without friends willing to anchor to him. He sat with his hands folded tightly around a glass of untouched champagne, staring at the crystal bubbles as though answers floated there. Around him people danced, couples swirled to the orchestra's rhythm, silks catching in the light, shoes tapping against marble floors. The joy in the room seemed to taunt his stillness. No one dared invite him to dance, or even join him at his table. Whispers circled the room like smoke around a flame. "He looks so out of place," a woman in emerald whispered beneath her diamonds. "All that money and still no one sits with him." A man chuckled low so Charles couldn't hear. "Even billions don't buy happiness, apparently." Charles ignored them, but every word carved a little deeper into the silence he carried. The truth was, he had built towers, yes, but he had abandoned bridges. The people he'd once called friends, family, even his own son, relationships shattered in the climb for power. And now, among hundreds of smiling guests, he was a public monument of loneliness. Among the staff weaving carefully through the crowd to refill glasses and clear plates was Naomi Brooks, 23 years old, working 2 jobs to pay for school. She had learned the art of vanishing into her uniform while surrounded by wealth. She carried a tray of empty goblets with ease, posture precise, face neutral. But Naomi had something else too, eyes sharper than most noticed. She watched the room with quiet clarity, seeing not just the gowns or tuxedos, but the fractures beneath. And she saw Charles Weston. Where others saw a billionaire unmoved by judgment, she saw a man crumbling silently behind a face carved from stone. His jaw clenched with the weight of silence. His hands gripped the glass like it was an anchor keeping him in place. Naomi hesitated near the edge of his table. She knew better than to interfere. Staff weren't meant to talk more than necessary, and certainly not to their city's most intimidating man. But something inside her refused to keep watching him swallowed whole by whispers. She set her tray down discreetly, leaned closer, not enough to draw attention, but close enough for him to hear. Her voice, soft and steady, cracked the shell of his solitude. "Pretend you're with me." Charles blinked, his eyes lifting sharply, caught off guard. His brows furrowed, confusion mixing with disbelief. Waitstaff didn't speak to him like that. People didn't speak to him like that. Naomi offered the faintest smile, covering the gesture as if checking his glass. "Just for tonight," she whispered under the music. "Pretend you're not sitting alone. Pretend you're with me." Something long buried in Charles's chest trembled. For a moment he wanted to laugh, to push her away, to bark back with the pride his reputation demanded. But then a laugh died in his throat. Pride had left him sitting alone all night. Here was someone who saw him in his ruin and offered something no merger or deal ever had: companionship without condition. His lips parted, voice low. "You just want me to pretend?" Naomi straightened, slipping his empty glass onto her tray. Her eyes stayed on his, calm, unbreaking. "Yes, sometimes pretending is easier than watching others watch you. I do it all the time." Charles felt the sting of her words. He looked at her, really looked. For the first time that evening, he noticed her not as invisible staff blending into shadows, but as a woman daring to reach across the canyon of status. Her face carried poise, her tone carried no pity. Why? Charles asked quietly, barely audible over the music. Naomi shrugged lightly, shifting the weight of her tray. Because you look like you need it. She turned then, stepping again into the flow of waiters crossing the ballroom floor. Charles sat frozen, her words echoing louder than the orchestra. Pretend you're with me. His chest rose, shaky with a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Around the room, eyes still watched, whispers still spilled. Weston looks broken, someone muttered. Imagine all this success and not a single real companion. But their whispers didn't cut quite as deep now, because in his mind he wasn't entirely alone. Naomi's phrase grew roots inside him. Pretend you're with me. She had offered him a script softer than reality, and without understanding why, he found himself clinging to it. Minutes later, he spotted Naomi again, weaving through laughter and wealth. His mind, sharp for contracts, heavy for negotiations, spun with a thought foreign to him. What if I don't have to pretend? And for the first time in years, Charles Weston no longer drank his champagne in silence. He watched the waitress moving between tables, her steps measured, her presence unnoticed by everyone but him. And in that crowded marble ballroom filled with every power player in the city, the most powerful of them all sat quietly repeating her words to himself. Pretend you're with me. They didn't feel like pretend anymore. Charles Weston had spent a lifetime commanding boardrooms where silence meant power and every word carried weight, measured in billions. Yet now those words, pretend you're with me, haunted him louder than any financial forecast. It had been less than 15 minutes since Naomi's whisper cracked through his loneliness, but to him it felt like the entire evening had shifted course. He sat back in his chair, still untouched champagne before him, his eyes trailing the woman no one else acknowledged. The staff moved like clockwork, bowing politely, lifting plates without sound, shifting seamlessly in and out of the background. But Naomi was different. Even under the black and white uniform, her presence anchored. She moved not as a shadow, but as someone fully inhabiting herself. Charles caught her again by the far column near the violinists, her tray stacked with emptied tumblers. For the first time in years of glittering events, he wasn't calculating deals or scanning for rivals. He was watching a woman whose sentence had lingered in his chest, like fire refused to die. Across the ballroom, guests had begun to notice. First discreet glances, then whispers. Look, Weston still hasn't spoken to anyone. Strange, isn't it, for a man with a reputation like his? Some chuckled, others smirked. Imagine being so feared outside of this room, but inside being pitied. Charles heard them. Every word pierced deeper than he let on. For decades he'd cultivated a shield against rumors and half-truths, but this wasn't about empire. This was about his exposed solitude. And Naomi had been the only one to admit it aloud. He adjusted his cufflinks, his mind teetering on impulse. The orchestra swelled. Couples whirled across the ballroom under spinning chandeliers. People laughed, swaying with gold and silk. At the edge of his table, Charles set down the untouched champagne and rose. The movement alone stole eyes. Men at other tables raised brows. Women turned faintly in curiosity. He's getting up, someone whispered. The smirks that followed tried to guess at intent. Would he make some grand toast? Approach the bride and groom with his infamous presence? People watched like gamblers waiting for odds. But Charles didn't walk toward the couple, the stage, or the investors. He walked toward the staff at the far column. And in an instant the murmurs sharpened into buzzing disbelief. He's going to the waitstaff? What is he doing? Charles moved with the authority ingrained into his posture, yet inside his chest tremored, like a fixated boy out of depth. Naomi turned slightly, startled as he approached. The tray in her hand nearly slipped before she steadied it. For a moment, the two worlds collided, the billionaire stepping beyond groomed power, the waitress blinking at the impossibility that someone like him came directly to her. Charles stopped, leaning slightly down toward her, his voice muted under the orchestra. "I'll indulge your suggestion," he said lowly. Naomi frowned faintly. "Suggestion? You said, pretend I'm with you," he murmured. "Let's pretend." Her eyes widened, not with fear but with fire. He wasn't mocking her. His tone lacked arrogance. It carried weight of sincerity. Still, she tilted her head, cautious. "Mr. Weston, this isn't—" "Charles," he interrupted gently. She blinked. "Not CEO, not sir, Charles." You invited me to escape solitude, he continued quietly. For once in my life, I'd rather not do it alone. So allow me, pretend. Naomi inhaled, her tray trembling lightly even as her eyes fixed on his. The background hum of whispers sharpened as eyes multiplied, locking onto a billionaire and a waitress locked in conversation. The gala had seen philanthropy speeches, celebrity couples, political performances, but never this. A titan of industry lowering himself before staff. Naomi finally set her tray on a side table, straightened, and whispered back, "You know they're all watching, right?" Charles smirked faintly, though his jaw twitched with nerves. "Let them." He extended his hand. The room seemed to dim in collective shock, the chandeliers brighter only because silence swelled. Guests whispered furiously, the orchestra's strings swelling into an almost otherworldly soundtrack as Naomi hesitated. Every second stretched like eternity. Naomi searched his eyes, measured his sincerity, and then, quietly but firmly, she placed her hand into his. Gasps snapped like electricity across the hall. Champagne glasses wavered in trembling hands. "He's dancing? With her?" someone exclaimed under breath. "Impossible." Charles led Naomi softly onto the dance floor. The orchestra, seemingly understanding the drama unfurling, leaned into a waltz rich with emotion. Couples slowed their steps, making space. Naomi's plain black apron contrasted violently against surrounding sequins and gowns, but her presence did not falter. She lifted her chin, pressed her palm against Charles's shoulder, and matched his rhythm as though she'd been trained. The whispers thickened, some snide, some amazed. "He's insane. No, look, he's alive." Charles Weston, the man whispered about as a machine in human form, finally looked human. His hand held Naomi's with steady strength, his eyes meeting hers in moments between turns, where the rest of the world blurred away. Naomi murmured through the step. "You don't owe them anything," Charles replied, gaze locked. "For once, I want to feel I owe myself." The applause didn't come this time. It wasn't yet admiration. But as the billionaire and the waitress glided in the center of the marble floor, the entire crowd couldn't look away. Every whisper confessed the same disbelief. A man untouchable by fortune had chosen authenticity over appearances, and the woman who dared whisper into his solitude had become the only one sharing his spotlight. At the edge of the floor, a woman in emerald muttered venomously, "He'll disgrace himself for this stunt." Beside her, a senator shook his head slowly. "No," he whispered, "he just saved himself." And in Naomi's steps, guiding his scars of loneliness, Charles finally believed it. The music swelled, violins and piano surrounding them like a screen against the murmuring crowd. Charles moved with awkward stiffness at first, his steps calculated not like a man used to dancing, but like someone reacquainting himself with a rhythm buried under years of forgotten joy. Naomi's hand steadied him, her confidence quiet but commanding. She whispered as they spun slowly near the center, "Relax, they can't do anything but watch." He exhaled heavily, finding a grim smile. "Watching is what they've always done. Applauding when I impress, whispering when I stumble." "Then let them whisper," Naomi said, meeting his eyes firmly. "This time the story is yours to write." The line stuck. For decades, Charles dictated the stories of markets, of buildings, of entire companies crumbling or soaring under his pen strokes. Yet in his own life, he'd surrendered authorship. Tonight, he realized he could seize it again, in the arms of a woman society didn't even think deserved a voice. Gasps continued at the edge of the hall. Some guests leaned forward, craning to capture every detail of this strange spectacle. Others sipped too quickly at champagne, murmuring about disgrace. How could he stoop this low? He's humiliating himself. Yet a few eyes, softer than the rest, showed awe instead of contempt. In the back row, a senator's wife leaned toward her husband. "Do you see his face? That's not humiliation. That's freedom." Guests conflicted, torn between loyalty to reputation and awe of authenticity. But the ballroom's binary judgment couldn't touch Charles in that moment. He found rhythm, his hand firm against Naomi's, his posture no longer brittle but intentional. Naomi leaned in near his shoulder, her voice like flint. "Are they seeing you? Or are they finally seeing the man you've kept buried?" Charles faltered slightly mid-step. The question hit deeper than any insult ever had. His father had once said, "Charles, wealth can make you visible but never truly seen." For decades he avoided the difference, Naomi, in one sentence, dragged it into light. When the song closed, silence fell heavier than applause. People hesitated, unsure whether to clap at all. The orchestra's last notes lingered like dust in sunbeams. Naomi released her grip, bowing her head respectfully, ready to return to her tray. But Charles didn't let her. His hand lingered with gravity, forcing her to pause. Behind them, the whispers escalated. "He's holding her hand still. Can you believe it? She's just staff. This is scandalous." Charles turned slowly, his deep voice carrying farther than he expected. "Your whispers mean nothing to me anymore." Gasps cut the air. A billionaire had never turned against his own crowd before, and never in defense of someone society painted invisible. Naomi's eyes widened slightly, her lips parting as she whispered back, "You don't have to—" "Yes," Charles interrupted, gaze locked. "I do." For the first time that night, scattered applause seeped forward. It began with a single clap from a guest in the far corner, hesitant but resolute. Then another, stronger. Within seconds, the ballroom fractured, not into full thunder but into split streams of approval and outrage. Some clapped proudly, others scowled, crossing arms tightly, refusing to validate what they saw as humiliation. Charles didn't move his hand. He didn't care about majority opinion. He only cared about the fact that he'd stood alone for years, and in one night Naomi had restored him to humanity. The MC, nervous, tried to shift attention. "Now if everyone will prepare to move toward the cake cutting." But the room hadn't settled. Conversations spilled with urgency. "He's turned his back on us," or turned his face toward what actually matters. Charles escorted Naomi back to the edge slowly, deliberately. She tried to slip away again into anonymity, but instead of releasing her quietly, he leaned down close. "Pretending is what you offered me. Living is what you gave me." "Thank you." Naomi, stunned, barely managed to whisper back, "Sir." "Charles," he corrected gently. Her heart fluttered at another crack in the billionaire's armor, but she resisted replying. She slipped behind the line of staff once more, shoulders back, both shaken and steadied at once. She had thought it would be a fleeting kindness. Instead, she had sparked a seismic shift. Across the ballroom, Charles returned to his table, this time not as a wall of stone, but something transformed. He noticed how the crowd looked at him differently now, half with disgust, half with raw curiosity. Power built by fear was crumbling, but strangely he felt lighter. Later in the evening, conversations boiled on. Some old money elites shook their heads at the disgrace. "He'll lose deals by morning." Others, particularly newer innovators and artists, remarked with admiration, "That's the bravest thing he's ever done." For once he looked alive. And Naomi, back among her fellow waitstaff, listened with conflicted amazement. She hadn't meant for this ripple. She only meant for one man not to sit alone. But the ripple had roared into waves. Behind her, the banquet supervisor leaned into her ear with sharp reproof. "Naomi, do you have any idea what you just did? You danced with Charles Weston in front of guests who fund our entire operation. If we lose this contract—" Naomi looked at her evenly, calm despite the storm brewing. "Then maybe we lost something we didn't need to keep." The supervisor's mouth fell open, but no words followed. Meanwhile, Charles moved to privately excuse himself, the whispers like tidal waves at his back. He noticed Naomi one last time, tray balanced like armor, face steady despite the knives of judgment around her. He realized then it hadn't been pretend after all. It had been a beginning, and for the remainder of the night, in a wedding gilded with dollars and diamonds, the only story worth telling was the one no guest could stop whispering. The billionaire CEO who stopped playing for the crowd when a waitress gave him back his humanity. The wedding ended, but the whispers didn't. They left the ballroom like sparks carried on wind, igniting chatter in luxury cars, drifting into penthouses and private jets. By dawn, social media feeds whispered the same rumor with blurry photos. Charles Weston, the untouchable billionaire, had danced with a waitress in front of the entire city's elite and defended it. At first, reactions blurred into predictable categories. Some spat ridicule, lonely old man trying to buy authenticity. Others, more intrigued, leaned toward awe. That was the first real moment I've ever seen from him. The video clips were grainy but powerful. The black and white uniform pressed against Charles's tuxedo contrasted like poetry. That contrast spread like wildfire. For Charles himself, morning came hollow. He sat in his penthouse, tie undone, staring out over a skyline he'd built but no longer recognized. His butler entered gently with coffee. "Sir, the Financial Times, the Post, even Talkline TV. They all called." Charles flicked his hand dismissively, but his gaze didn't shift. He already knew. The Empire choked him differently now. When his advisor rang, panic laced the voice. "Charles, if you don't push a statement, markets will wobble. Investors are cautious about unpredictability." "They need reassurance." Charles cut him off. "All my investors saw proof that I bleed. If they leave for that, let them. I'm done being concrete." The line fell silent. On the other end, disbelief hissed into stammering, "Sir, what does that mean?" But Charles hung up. In the small apartment Naomi shared with her younger sister, the fallout had landed differently. Her sister shoved a phone under her nose, headlines glaring, "Waitress who dared to dance." Naomi flushed with disbelief. "They caught pictures?" "Yes," her sister whispered, half awed, half afraid. "Naomi, you're trending." Naomi covered her face with her hands. She never wanted spectacle. She had whispered only kindness, but now the world had rewound it into a performance. At the diner job she worked mornings, co-workers clutched the articles and gasped. "Girl, you were with Charles Weston? That's insane." Customers eyed her differently. One even asked for a selfie. Naomi brushed it off. Fame wasn't her victory. Andrew, her fatherless younger brother at the apartment, said it most clearly. "You reminded a powerful man he's human. That matters." Meanwhile, Charles was summoned by his board. The room brimmed with fear disguised as authority. "This has caused instability," one barked. "Showing weakness at that level? Aligning with staff, it tarnishes investor confidence." Charles sat back in his chair, unimpressed. Confidence isn't tarnished by truth. It's damaged by pretending lies hold forever. Gasps darted across the polished table. The board exchanged glances, realizing the man before them wasn't bargaining. He was breaking chains they hadn't even realized he'd worn. Later, in the quiet of his skyscraper office, Charles asked his secretary to bring Naomi. Surprised, she arrived still in her cafe uniform, face flushed from work. She sat across his vast desk like a shadow in a cathedral, dwarfed by wealth, yet steady. "I didn't mean for your world to explode," Naomi said quickly, eyes steady. "You meant for me not to sit alone," Charles corrected, voice raw. "And you did more than you know." Her brow furrowed. "These people, they'll ridicule you, tear you apart for looking less like a king and more like, well, a man." Charles nodded. "Good, I am a man. I forgot that long ago." "But you, Naomi, you reminded me. You gave me sight." He rubbed his temple, pausing. "Why did you risk it?" Naomi's hands folded on her knees. "Because when I serve these people night after night, I see loneliness, desperation under diamonds. I learned scars aren't only on faces. They're carried in rooms where no one looks. And I couldn't let you sit among them invisible, because I know what that feels like." Charles inhaled, sharp, staggering. No board member, no rival, no ally had ever dared to reveal him so nakedly. "I can't repay you with money," he said finally. "Name what I owe." Naomi shook her head strongly. "Don't turn it into a transaction. Just carry it forward. Treat your son as seen. Your workers, yourself, that's repayment." Silence dug deep into the room. Charles Weston, titan of skyscrapers, suddenly looked more like Charles Weston, man. He lowered his gaze, nodded slowly. "Then that is what I'll do." The tabloids thought scandal would sink him. Instead, weeks later at the next quarterly gala, Charles did something bolder. He walked onto the stage, cameras flashing, investors tense. His speech began differently this time. "I have been rich in walls and poor in bridges," he told the crowd. "But not tonight. Tonight I tell you weakness is power when it's honest. And strength, true strength, is allowing yourself to be seen." Naomi stood at the back of the hall in catering black, head high. His eyes found hers across the crowd, and a faint nod sealed the quiet alliance they'd forged. The applause began cautiously, but then turned thunderous. Not because investors admired philosophy, but because deep down everyone in that hall carried loneliness too. And someone had finally called it aloud. 2 weeks later, the city buzzed differently when Charles Weston appeared. No longer cloaked in icy intimidation, he walked into spaces that once cowered before him and met eyes instead of dodging them. The media painted it as reinvention. To him, it was rebirth. But the true shift came one quiet evening when Charles returned to the same wedding venue, this time for a follow-up charity ball. The chandeliers glimmered again, the orchestra played again, and the same wealthy faces filled the same seats. Yet Charles chose something different. He didn't sit alone. He walked to the catering station where Naomi was arranging glassware. She looked up, startled. Before she could speak, he smiled faintly. One more dance. This time not pretending? Gasps floated as he extended his hand in plain sight. Naomi hesitated, embarrassment flushing, but his sincerity steadied her. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. They stepped onto the floor again. This time, no shock silenced the room. Applause swelled immediately. Not choreographed, but genuine, cathartic. Guests clapped because in seeing them together, they too felt permitted to drop their masks. For once, wealth bowed before authenticity. Charles moved calmly, guiding Naomi in slow rhythm. "You taught me something I can never unlearn," he murmured near her ear, voice soft beneath the violins. "That strength isn't solitude. It's connection. And dignity isn't reserved for the rich. It's for anyone willing to offer it." Naomi's lips curled into a small smile. "Funny. All I meant to do was keep you company so you didn't look lonely." Charles chuckled, rare and real. "And you ended up changing everything." At the far edge of the ballroom, reporters scribbled, lenses clicked. But the moment didn't belong to the story they'd spin tomorrow. It belonged to them, the billionaire and the waitress. No longer roles, just people daring to disturb the script of social expectation. When the music ended, Charles didn't let go immediately. He looked around the room, his voice carrying as he spoke. "To every one of you, remember this. Fortune hides scars, status hides fear, but kindness unmasks what we forget." That night she whispered, "Pretend you're with me." And in pretending, I finally discovered the truth. I don't have to be alone. Silence, then thunderous applause. This time applause less for Charles, more for the truth aloud. Less for power, more for the reminder they all needed. Naomi bowed lightly and stepped back into her work. Charles let her, because he finally understood that not all heroes needed spotlights. Some lived in whispers, some danced one song once and left their impact etched forever. And as the chandeliers glowed above, the city's richest man no longer sat alone. Because even if life demanded pretending, one voice had already reminded him of what connection feels like. It felt like truth.